Chapter 7 is entitled Self-Mediation. Self-mediation is a term that is being used in media studies and media sociology to refer to the production and sharing of media content and media experiences by ordinary people. So we are therefore talking about the circulation of audiovisual texts created by non-professionals, and obviously these are texts that, because they are being circulated globally, they need to be translated as well. So self-mediation therefore is a process that incorporates an element of audiovisual translation, which I examine in detail in this chapter. As opposed to the way in which audiovisual translation has normally been done in the, let's call it, professional commercial era, in the current context of production and consumption that comes under the heading of self-mediation, a lot of translation tends to be done by network communities. So these are geographically dispersed, in many cases, groups of people who work together, obviously by making use of new technologies. These are communities that can have different interests when it comes to participating in processes of self-mediation. So there are playful subcultures that have developed in relation to the mediation of Japanese anime, for example, or indeed more recently the mediation of many other series or even films produced in different countries in the world. But at the same time, we've got other communities or networks that are much more monitorial, as the literature authors like Dewes, for example, would call them. So in other words, citizens who are very politically engaged, who are very critical, who have activist agendas, and they want to pursue those agendas by making use of audiovisual translation. I try to do a number of things in this chapter to reveal the importance of self-mediation within the field of audiovisual translation and vice versa, to show the extent to which audiovisual translation is contributing to the development of self-mediation. One of the things I do, for example, is I look at how these network communities are organized. And it seems clear that there is a very interesting diversity in terms of forms of organization. So there are relatively structured and well-organized communities, some of which even replicate the workflow and the hierarchies of what we would regard as professional contexts. And they do this in a sort of self-organizing way, without an external or imposed set of priorities or guidelines. But we also have much more fluid and difficult to pin down forms of organization that I call adhocracies. There are three main issues that I try to highlight in the chapter. The first one is that a lot of these communities see their work as a form of resistance against different things. It could be against what they regard low quality of commercially existing versions of some programs, or it could be against resistance against certain political or economic interests that they articulate by circulating audiovisual content translated in certain ways to highlight that disagreement, that clash in political orientation. In relation with the notion of resistance is another very important notion, which is that of affectivity. And this is a very important one because it's very clear that what drives the work of these different agencies involved in audiovisual translation in the context of self-mediation is the need to establish affective links with their audiences, the audiences of which the subtitlers, for example, the fan dubbers, for example, are to some extent a part. They are part of the audience, so they know what the audience wants, and that shows in many ways their practices try to enhance that mutual affectivity that exists between the producers and users of those translations. And finally, the third feature, which I would describe as the non-representational function of these translations. So, in this self-mediation context, unlike what has always happened professionally, commercially, the issue of achieving linguistic equivalence, linguistic correspondence in many cases is not a priority at all. What these translators want to do is develop platforms to express their own subjective experience, and in many cases that means that they pay very little attention to the actual content of the original text. In some other cases, there is a high degree of correspondence, but what translators do is highlight their the idiosyncratic nature of their mediation in different ways, and that, for example, in the context of subtitling, has to do with the use of what they regard as performative subtitles. It could be through, for example, the use of subtitles where the materiality of the subtitle, that's the physical dimension of the subtitle, becomes very evident during the process of mediation. Basically, conventions, forms of translating that enhance the connection, the mutual recognition between the producer and the user of the translation. I think it's important to also include in this chapter, and obviously that's the reason why I've done so, the fact that self-mediation and the forms of audiovisual translation that are becoming associated with it are influencing the way in which commercial media content is being translated. So I provide in the final part of my chapter a number of examples of how some relatively new ways of translating commercial media content could be regarded as under the influence of some of the practices developed in the context of self-mediation.